This episode is sponsored by Hive. Britain revolutionised the future with the might of industrial power. But now you can transform your own energy future and take control with the power of Hive.
Hive makes the most of the sun, with solar panels turning sunlight into greener electricity and enabling you to sell excess back to the grid.
And Hive's thermostats make it possible for you to heat your home without lifting anything more than a thumb and an impressed brow.
Their heat pumps draw warmth from the air and they keep it exactly where you want it. No smoke, no waste.
Hive's EV charger lets your car charge quietly overnight, recharging while you do too.
Hive brings it all together. Heating, charging and solar, managed from one simple app in a quiet revolution.
In the long history of power, Hive helps you finally know yours. Head to hivehome.com to find out more. Subject to survey and suitability. Hive app compatible with selected technology. Paid for surplus requires SEG tariff. London lies today under the spell of a great terror. A nameless reprobate, half beast, half man, is at large, who is daily gratifying his murderous instincts on the most miserable and defenseless classes of the community. There can be no shadow of a doubt now that our original theory was correct, and that the Whitechapel murderer, who has now 4, if not 5, victims to his knife, is one man, and that man, a murderous maniac. Hideous malice, deadly cunning, insatiable thirst for blood. All these are the marks of the mad homicide. The ghoul-like creature who stalks through the streets of London, stalking down his victim like a Pawnee Indian, is simply drunk with blood, and he will have more. The question is, what are the people of London to do? The police have not even a clue. They are in despair at their utter failure to get so much as a scent of the criminal. London must rouse itself. No woman is safe while this ghoul is abroad. Up, citizens, then, and do your own police work. So that was the Evening Star on Saturday, the 8th of September, 1888, after the discovery of yet another victim of the Whitechapel murderer. And I use the phrase Whitechapel murderer advisedly because he is not yet known as Jack the Ripper. Although, Dominic, today we will be exploring how the Whitechapel murderer comes to get that appellation.
We will indeed. Yes. So let's remind people where and when we are. We are in the late summer of 1888. We are in the East End of London, which we described last time as this kind of labyrinth, this warren of crowded, narrow streets and sort of reeking tenement slums. And it's a national byword, the East End, for poverty, for homelessness, for prostitution, and for crime. And one other thing that's going to become very important in the next couple of episodes, it's an area that is being transformed by immigration, specifically Jewish refugees from the pogroms in Russia and in Poland. So to recap the story of the last episode, Tom, you described how on the 7th of August, a woman called Martha Tabram was found murdered in a tenement building off Whitechapel High Street, and her body had been stabbed almost 40 times, to quote the accounts at the time, butchered with virulent savagery. And then in the second half of the last episode, we talked about a second body, which was found in a narrow lane called Bucks Row, just before 4 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of August. And this is another woman who was lying on her back, and the details, as they will be throughout this series, even more horrific. Her throat slashed from ear to ear, her body ripped open to reveal her intestines. And this was Mary Ann, or Polly Nichols, very poor, alcoholic, homeless, possibly an occasional prostitute. And she's the first of the canonical 5 Ripper victims, because really, although it's quite possible that Martha Tabram was also killed by the same man, It's with Polly Nichols that the press furore begins and the Jack the Ripper phenomenon begins, I suppose, doesn't it?
Yeah. And the police, as we mentioned in the previous episode, are at a complete loss. There are no clues. None of the people who lived in Bucks Row had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. And the press, as you mentioned, I mean, they had been fascinated by the murder of Martha Tabram. It had received quite a lot of coverage, a unique and mysterious crime because of its sheer savagery, the East London Observer said. And because of that, and because you now have a second killing, the newspapers immediately assume that both Martha and Polly have been killed by the same person, and that this person must be a lunatic or perhaps someone of blood-drinking, vampiric, cannibalistic tastes.
Yes.
And so on the evening Polly's found, the Evening Star, which is the biggest evening paper in Britain, runs the banner headlines, "Revolting Murder, Another Woman Found Horribly Mutilated in Whitechapel, Ghastly Crimes by a Maniac." And Dominic, then as now, these are the kind of headlines that are guaranteed to get readership, aren't they?
They are indeed, absolutely. And the same paper comes back to the story in the next few days, so the very next day. In each case, the victim has been a woman of abandoned character. Each crime has been committed in the dark hours of the morning, and more important still, as pointing to one man, and that man a maniac, being the culprit, each murder has been accompanied by hideous mutilation. And the paper says, clearly these crimes are, quote, the work of some cool, cunning man with a mania for murder. They love a bit of alliteration in a late Victorian newspaper. The reason that we're quoting so much from the newspapers is that they are absolutely central, not necessarily to the crimes, but to the Jack the Ripper phenomenon, to the historical phenomenon of the Jack the Ripper case. Because I think, as lots of Ripper historians think, this is as much a story about the newspapers and about publishing, and indeed about mass literacy, as it is one about crime or poverty or prostitution. And part of that, I think, is because so much of what we know about the murders actually comes to us from newspaper reports.
Yeah.
So not from official documents.
Because a lot of those have been lost, haven't they? The inquest reports and so on.
Exactly. So what we know of the inquests comes to us often through the newspapers or street scenes and so on. And there's a brilliant book on the Ripper case, I think the definitive book, really, by a guy called Philip Sugden. And if that name rings a slight bell, it's because he's actually the brother of the John Sugden, who's the definitive biographer of Nelson.
I mean, imagine the discussions they have at Christmas.
Yeah, incredible. So Philip Sugden's book is called The Complete History of Jack the Ripper. And, you know, it's, I think, by far the most scholarly and sort of serious book on this. And he points out that the newspapers in 1888 are competing for a new readership, and they're doing so with ever gorier and more salacious stories. And so everything that we understand about the Jack the Ripper is coloured by that. And the context for this is that Britain has been transformed by the 1870 and 1880 Education Acts, which mandated state education and basically drove up adult literacy to 100% for the first time in history. So for the first time, Britain is genuinely a nation of readers. And the streets are awash with people selling, for example, penny dreadfuls. These are these cheap stories of crime and horror and adventure and mystery that are read overwhelmingly by young men and boys. And I think the entire reporting of the Ripper phenomenon, including Jack the Ripper's name, owes a huge amount to these penny dreadfuls. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And then the other is the mass market newspaper. So newspapers are cheaper than ever before to produce, new technology and so on. There's hundreds of competing titles, and crime and sex are absolutely central to their appeal. So one example that we'll come back to, the Pall Mall Gazette. Tom, tell us about the Pall Mall Gazette.
There's a case for saying that the Pall Mall Gazette is the original tabloid newspaper of the kind that anyone who's read a British newspaper will be familiar with. And it was edited by a guy from Northumbria called W.T. Stead throughout the 1880s, who ultimately would end up on Titanic. So that's a link between the two stories. And he ran a series of incredibly sensational stories, exposés, of which the most famous was a crusade against child prostitution. And these stories and campaigns have a direct knock-on effect on the program of slum clearance that is lapping at the borders of Whitechapel throughout this period, and the closing of brothels. And we will be coming to him and his role in the story in a later episode.
Yeah.
But he's a key figure.
So it's through papers like the Pall Mall Gazette and its competitors that people know about the murders. They both stoke and they report the fear and anger on the streets. So there's a great example. The 4th of September, the Daily News sends a reporter down to Bucks Row, where the body was found. And he says he finds, crowds of poor women who are sort of studying the paving stones for bloodstains. And he takes great glee in reporting what they say. I say reporting, but of course...
Yeah, he might be making it up.
He might be making it up, right? Because it sounds often too good to be true. Because he says, there's a little woman with a rosy cherub face who says to him, life ain't no great thing with many on us, but we don't all want to be murdered. And if things go on like this, it won't be safe for nobody to put their heads out of doors. And this is precisely the kind of thing the readers of the newspaper want East End women to say.
But Dominic, I mean, there is also, I mean, it is expressive of a genuine sentiment of kind of horror and people rallying together, isn't it? And so there's huge crowds for Polly Nichols when she's buried in the City of London cemetery.
Of course.
In Ilford. And this was a woman who was on her own. And now at her death, there are people who think, well, you know, she was one of ours. It's not just made up, is it?
Well, no. It brings out the latent sentimentality of the British silent majority. Do you not think of the British working classes? That's always there. And of course, all of this, the genuine horror and fear on the streets, plus the press, puts enormous pressure on the police. And we haven't really talked that much about the police so far. So I think in the popular imagination, there's a general sense that the police are either unbelievably incompetent or uniquely malevolent, don't you?
I'd say they're incompetent, aren't they?
They're either the blundering fools of Sherlock Holmes, the Lestrade and his colleagues, who are always one step behind the murderer and, of course, any amateur private detective who might want to investigate this case.
Yeah.
And I think most serious historians are much more generous and say, you know, the police are far from perfect, but they're actually, you know, in an age before modern technology, they're doing the very best that they can in an impossible situation. So to paint a picture, the Metropolitan Police was set up by Sir Robert Peel in 1829. If you think of the Met's catchment area, as it were, you're looking at around about 6 million people, and they have 15,000 men to do it. Of course, they are all men. Now, today, the Met has 43,000 people policing about 8.5 million people. So they're comparatively understaffed back in the 1880s. In some ways, they're a more modern organization. So their police stations are linked by telegraph, but they're still working out of the sort of original, very cramped sort of office building in Whitehall, Scotland Yard. And in recent months, in particular, they've become very controversial. You mentioned in the last episode the Chief Commissioner of the Met, Sir Charles Warren. He's come from a military background, hasn't he?
So he served 2 terms in South Africa, but also just because it will feed into some of the theories that we'll be talking about in our final episode. He is a Freemason, and he has an obsessive interest in the site of the temple in Jerusalem, which is fundamental to Freemasonry. And he'd spent a term in Palestine and had conducted the first serious archaeological excavation of Temple Mount, the site of the temple. So I just throw that out as some contextualization.
Maybe that's an important clue, or maybe it's a mad red herring, but we will find out. Anyway, he's been trying to modernize the Met, you know, reflecting his military background. He's been trying to centralize it, to bring in more military discipline, and to bring in more people from the army. And at the same time, the Met has been dragged into politics. So, for example, you talked last time about the Bloody Sunday, sort of the homeless camp, the demonstrations. The police had cracked down on it, and radical papers have ever since been painting the police as a tool of the capitalist establishment, you know, a tool of repression of the working class. It's literally like listening to Theo Young-Smith, our producer, isn't it? So the police have been getting a lot of stick, and they're in a very difficult place. Now, these murders are a massive challenge for the police, as they would be today, but even more so. So to remind people, the crimes so far have been carried out in this warren of very poor, very narrow streets at night with no witnesses. The killer, they assume, works alone. I mean, I think this is what most people who study the Jack the Ripper murders still believe. There was just one person. He has no accomplices. He leaves no trace and no clues. He has no obvious motive.
That's the key thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, today, people would say, oh, but there's an obvious motive. Serial killers do have motives. They're mad. But people don't have a sense of this in the 1880s. The studies have not yet been done on serial killers. So people are bewildered and horrified. This is why there's so much talk of him being a maniac. And to make matters more difficult for the police, the people he kills and their friends are the kind of people who generally keep, as it were, to the shadows of society. They are down and out, they're poor, they're homeless, they've maybe been in trouble with the police. They're part of the sort of the underclass, as it were. So all of this means that it's a tough case to solve. Police forces today find such cases very difficult to solve. But in 1888, the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, they are only 10 years old. They can't test blood. There's no fingerprint bureau. That doesn't get opened until 1901. And they don't have a science laboratory. They don't have any formal laboratory, and they won't have one for another 40 years. So as Philip Sugden, to quote him, says, the odds were in favor of Jack the Ripper from the very beginning. You don't have to believe there's a cover-up or a conspiracy. It would have been a very difficult case to solve.
But also, just to throw into the mix, there's also the evident fact that the murder is incredibly audacious, very opportunistic, and clearly, I think, very lucky.
Yes,
so
I think
these
so.
are all factors that are making it more difficult for the police.
Exactly. So now at this stage, the police, I think, it's just 2 murders as far as they're concerned, if you count Martha Tabram. And they see no great cause for alarm. So Sir Charles Warren has been on holiday in France, and they've just brought in a new guy, Dr. Robert Anderson, as Assistant Commissioner and Head of CID. But on the 7th of September, he leaves for a month's holiday in Switzerland. When he takes the job, he says, sure, I'll take the job, but I'd like to go on holiday in Switzerland first. And they later get a lot of stick for this. But of course, it never occurs to them at the time that these, apparently inconsequential killings in the East End will become defining stories of late Victorian Britain. Why would it? As far as they're concerned, these are 2 kind of homeless women or whatever who've been murdered. So what? They've gone on holiday. But the newspapers, I think it's pretty clear, are itching for the next installment because they can see that this is going to be a big story.
Because this is how the Victorian publishing industry works, isn't it? Through installments.
Yeah.
And, if you're kind of waiting for the next chapter in the story, then when it happens, you're going to go massive with it.
Of course. And you get a sense of them. They're desperate for it to happen. So the East London Advertiser, we've quoted that already. This came on the streets, this newspaper, on the morning of Saturday, the 8th of September. Throughout the week, the interest in the Whitechapel murder has been kept at fever heat. The murderer must creep out from somewhere. He must patrol the streets in search of his victims. Doubtless, he's out night by night. Every woman in those parts goes in nightly danger of her life as long as he remains at large.
So here's a thought.
Yeah.
What if it's a newspaper editor?
To improve circulation.
Yeah.
That's a good thought, actually.
Throw that into the mix.
Listeners can let Tom know what they think of that suggestion. No need to let me know, just let Tom know personally.
I think I might have contributed what is very unusual in ripperology, an original theory there.
Wow, that's exciting. Well, listen, even as people were reading those words in the East London Advertiser, that the murderer must creep out, he must strike again, on that Saturday morning, the news is spreading that just as predicted, the Ripper has struck again.
Well, Dominic, the Whitechapel murderer.
Yes, of course, you're right. He's not yet the Ripper. So the scene is 29 Hanbury Street in Spitalfields. And it's on the north side of the street. We're in a dilapidated 3-story house at number 29. Almost every room of this house is rented by a different family, and that tells its own story. So it's a real warren of people. And to picture the house, at the back of the house, there are 3 stone steps that go down into a little yard. And in the yard, there is an outside toilet, and there's a wood shed, and the whole thing is enclosed by a wooden fence. And it's very tight. It's very narrow. And that Saturday morning, the 8th of September, some of the people living in the house get up very early because it's market day and they're going to work. As you said before, this is going to be a theme of this whole story.
Yeah.
And one of them is a guy who's a carman, which is a kind of cart driver, called John Davis. He's a little man with a stoop, and he rents the attic, and he lives in the attic with his family. And he gets up when the Spitalfield church clock strikes 5:45 a.m. His wife makes him a cup of tea because he's going off to the Leadenhall market. He goes downstairs, and he notices that the door to the street is wide open. Now, that's nothing unusual. There's so many people living in the house. They're coming and going. They're working odd hours and things. So he shuts that door. Then he goes to the back door. The back door is closed. He goes out to the back door into the yard because he just wants to take some air before he goes off to work. And he steps outside and he sees something terrible. It's the body of a woman sprawled on her back between the steps and the fence. And he rushes back through the house and into the street. He hails some workmen. The workmen come and look. They're very shaken. They go off to find a policeman. And by the time the policeman, Inspector Joseph Chandler, arrives, the place is packed. So the house is suddenly alive. There's loads of people in the corridors and in the hall and stuff. But no one's gone out into the yard. They've left it alone. So he pushes through and he goes into the yard. He's the first person to inspect the body. And to quote his written report, and of course this will be very gruesome, so if you're listening to this in the car with small children, I mean, frankly, why are you listening to a podcast about Jack the Ripper with small children? But anyway, you've been warned. He said, "I at once proceeded to number 29 Hanbury Street, and in the backyard found a woman lying on her back, dead, left arm resting on left breast, legs drawn up, abducted, small intestines and flap of the abdomen lying on the right side, above right shoulder, attached by a cord with the rest of the intestines inside the body. 2 flaps of skin from the lower part of the abdomen lying in a large quantity of blood above the left shoulder, throat cut deeply from left and back in a jagged manner right around throat." So it's a hideous spectacle, and it's confirmed by the police surgeon, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who's very highly respected and in his 50s. And he's an important person. Some of his thoughts about who might have done this kind of run right through this case. Phillips thinks that it's possible that the victim was strangled first, and then there was this terrible savage cut in her throat.
And that is one of the factors that would have stopped there being kind of excessive blood loss.
Exactly. And then the really shocking thing, the really gory thing, the abdomen was cut open, and basically the intestines were taken out and placed by the victim's shoulder. And then Dr. Phillips finds that the victim's uterus, most of her bladder, and part of her vagina were completely removed with a kind of clean cut and taken away. Now, of course, I've called her the victim, but this was, let's remind ourselves, a living, breathing woman with an inner life of her own. And her name was Annie Chapman. And we will be talking about her life and what brought her to this position on our bonus episode for club members, along with the lives of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, 2 of the other victims. So if you're not a member of the Rest is History Club, you can sign up at therestishistory.com and you'll find out about these lives and what they tell us about the late Victorian world. But a quick summary, just for now, about Annie. She was 47. She'd had a very tragic life. Her father was a soldier and then a kind of a manservant. She'd been born in West London. She'd married a coachman. And as actually with Polly Nichols, the curse is alcoholism. She's been a drinker from a young age. She has 3 children, but she ends up separating from her husband because of drink, because of disorderly conduct and whatnot. By the time she gets to 1888, she's very badly off.
She's ill with tuberculosis as well, isn't she?
Yes, tuberculosis. She's kind of drifting from one doss house to another. We can discuss in the bonus episode whether or not she is a prostitute. What we do know is on the afternoon of the 7th of September, she'd run out of money. She said to a friend of hers, "I need to go and get some money, otherwise I shall have no lodgings."
So very like Polly Nichols. I mean, almost identical.
Exactly. She did get some money, whether through begging or through selling sexual services, we don't know. But then she spent the money on drink instead of lodgings, and that decision cost her life.
So again, like Polly.
Yeah, because she was kicked out of her lodging house on 35 Dorset Street. She goes out just before 2 a.m. onto the streets, probably to earn the coppers for a bed. And her last words, "I shall soon be back, don't let the bed."
And so, Dominic, right from the moment that Annie Chapman's body is discovered, the police recognise that they are dealing with the same killer who had dispatched Polly definitely, and probably Martha before her.
Yes.
And they assigned to the case the same inspector who is handling the investigation into Polly Nichols' death. And this is a guy called Frederick Aberline, who is age 45. He's from Dorset, the son of a clerk, and he is often traduced, isn't he, in kind of popular versions of the Ripper story. And he's kind of portrayed as an alcoholic or weirdly obsessed with prostitutes or being comically incompetent. Although in the film From Hell, he's portrayed by Johnny Depp as an opium addict who sees glimpses into the truth of the actual case. And, Johnny Depp has his very fine features and his cheekbones and everything. In reality, Aberline had the appearance of a bank manager. So he's very stocky, he's very round-faced, and he has an absolutely colossal Victorian moustache.
He does. Yeah, we like a good moustache on this show, and that endears Aberline to me, I have to say. I think Aberline is really, really hard done by in the sort of pop history versions of this case, because all the evidence we have is that he was a very, very good policeman. He had risen through the ranks precisely because he was competent, efficient, reliable.
And he knows Spitalfields like the back of his hand, doesn't he?
He genuinely does. He's an old East End hand. He'd been in charge of the CID in Whitechapel in the late 1870s and early 1880s. He is the obvious man to put on this case because he knows the area, he has contacts there, and he will go on to work incredibly hard on this case. He goes for days without sleep, and he's drowning in paper and stuff, and he's doing his absolute best. So it's really harsh for these sort of, to portray him as this sort of prostitute crazed drug addict is bonkers.
Yeah, and I think he is highly regarded by his peers, and he does come up with two quite influential theories as to who the Ripper might have been, which again we will be exploring in due course.
So the problem that he faces, as before, is that there are no clues. The local tenants, the people living in 29 Hanbury Street, have seen nothing. This body has just appeared in the yard overnight, and they don't know how it got there. None of the neighbours, of course the police talk to every single neighbour, none of them have seen anybody acting suspiciously or with blood-stained hands or clothes or whatever. However, there are three important witnesses, so we should take a bit of time to look at what these people say. The first one is a market porter called John Richardson, and his mother rented the ground floor rooms at number 29. Now, she'd had a break-in, very common in this area. And so every market morning, he would go to just check the door of her cellar to see that it was locked. And he'd done so this morning. He'd actually gone out into the yard just before 5 o'clock in the morning to fix his boot, and he didn't see a body. So that means that Annie must have died after 5 o'clock.
Unless he did it.
Well, unless he did it, I suppose. So we've got quite a narrow window of time now, because that bloke who found the body, remember, he heard the Spitalfields clock toll 5:45. So we're narrowing down the window. The second witness is a local woman called Elizabeth Long. And at about 5:30 in the morning, she'd been walking along Hanbury Street to Spitalfields Market, and she'd seen a man and woman talking outside number 29. And she later went to the mortuary, and she positively identified the woman as Annie Chapman.
I mean, that's a very narrow window then.
Yes.
It's only 15 minutes, isn't it? I mean, less than 15 minutes.
So if she's right, and I think she probably is right, then the murder must be committed between about 5:30 and 5:45. And not only does she say this woman was Annie Chapman, she gives us a pretty good description of the man that was talking to Annie. And I'll quote it. He was dark complexioned and wearing a brown deerstalker hat. I think he was wearing a dark coat. He was a man over 40 as far as I could tell. He seemed to be a little taller than the deceased. Now, Annie was quite short. She was 5 foot tall. He's only a little taller, so he's maybe 5'3", 5'4", 5'5", something like that. He looked to me like a foreigner as well as I could make out. Hard to say what that means. He looked what I should call shabby genteel. Philip Sugden, in his brilliant book on the Jack the Ripper case, says, this man was the murderer. This is what the murderer looks like. And actually, in the next couple of episodes, we'll be describing other witnesses and other murders who see similar looking men, short, moustache, deerstalker hat. this is a common kind of description, isn't it? It's a common profile, Tom.
Yeah.
And one thing that he is not, by the way, he's not tall. And there's no sense whatsoever, really important and probably disappointing for the conspiracy theorist community among our listeners. He's not an aristocrat. He's not wearing a top hat or an opera cloak.
He's not carrying a medical bag.
No, he's not carrying a medical bag. He is none of those things.
Although witnesses will in due course claim to have seen such a man.
They will indeed. Yes, we will be coming to that. Now, I said there were 3 witnesses. The third witness is a carpenter called Albert Kadosh. He lived next door to number 29, number 27. He got up early and he said at about 5:20 or so, he couldn't be sure, he went out into the yard and he heard low voices from over the fence and the only word he could make out was no. And then a few minutes later, he said he heard a noise like, and I quote, something falling against the fence. Then he left for work and as he passed Spitalfields Church, he looked up and he saw the clock and he noted that it was 5:32. So that would seem to sort of tally. You know, Mrs. Long sees the couple talking round about 5:30. Then he, similar time, hears people talking in the yard. And then he hears someone falling against a fence. And then at 5:32, he looks up and sees the clock. You know, they're probably out. Each of them is out probably by a couple of minutes because people can never be precise about these things. But it seems to tally. So remember that Annie had gone out to earn some money just around 2 a.m. So there are 2 possibilities. Possibility number 1, Hallie Rubenhold, in her book, The Five, she believes all the women were killed as they slept. So she thinks Annie just went into the yard of number 29. She lay down in a corner, went to sleep, and was murdered as she slept. Philip Sugden, on the other hand, she went out to solicit to get customers. Sometime around 5:30, just before 5:30, she fell in with the killer. He took her into the yard, or she took him into the yard, rather. Then he probably strangled her, lowered her to the ground, cut her throat, and then started the ripping process.
Mrs. Long's testimony would suggest that is probably more feasible, wouldn't it?
Definitely would. And I don't think Hallie Rubenhold mentions Mrs. Long's testimony in her book, The Five, but I find it quite convincing. So a couple of quick observations from this before we take the break. Number 1, as you said, Tom, the killer is incredibly daring. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The sun rose that day at 5:23. So it is light when he is going about his business. And it is a market morning. There are loads of people moving around. Even as he and Annie are in the yard, people are getting up in the house and moving about.
Yeah, which makes the question of motivation all the more striking. I mean, what is so desperate that he would take such incredible risks?
Are the risks not the thrill? Is that not the thrill of it for him, do you think?
But I'm just thinking in terms of the police.
Yes.
I mean, these are kind of dimensions of psychology that they're not really attuned to as yet.
Of course not. They don't employ psychologists or anything like that.
No.
Number 2, the killer is incredibly quick and he obviously knows the area. So if he did this crime, you know, and did the disemboweling and stuff, he's done it in a matter of moments, you know, no hesitation or anything. He's very fast and then he gets away so quickly. And there's a really interesting little clue. There was a tap in the yard with a pail of clean water underneath. And it was still there after he had left. In other words, he didn't clean himself. He didn't turn the tap on because it would have had blood in it. So in other words, he has left covered presumably in blood. I mean, I know you don't bleed that much if you've been strangled and then stabbed, but the disemboweling would be gory work, right?
Yeah.
He's got away through the warren of streets, carrying some of Annie Chapman's internal organs without being spotted. So he must know the area, right? Here's a spoiler alert. I think if you're a member of the royal family, you're going to get lost in that area and you're going to be spotted pretty quickly, frankly.
Yeah. Or a distinguished former prime minister or whatever.
Yeah. Or if you're the elephant man, frankly, people are going to spot you.
Yeah.
Right? Finally, the killer knows what he's doing. This is a really, really important thing. Dr. Phillips said, to take out those internal organs would have taken me an hour. You know, to do the surgery, to find them, all of this. The killer must have done it in moments, in minutes, 5 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. The coroner at the inquest said he must have been somebody who had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. You know, he basically knew what he wanted, where to find it, and how to use his knife. No unskilled person could have known where to find it. This is the victim's uterus, or could have recognized it when it was found. Now, that doesn't mean the victim must be a doctor or a surgeon, but it does mean it's somebody who knows a fair bit about anatomy and knows how to use a knife.
So perhaps a butcher or a medical student, or perhaps a slaughterman working in one of the knackers yards or whatever.
Exactly. So, all interesting clues. Anyway, Annie is buried in secret on the 14th of September. And by this point, Whitechapel is in a state of near hysteria. And we'll come back to the heart of the East End after the break.
This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money.
Tom, we often talk about how to organise our finances. I'm very conscious that I'm paying for a lot of mad subscriptions. And there's one thing that we've talked about often on this show. It's the thing that we probably hate more than any other, and it's a hidden fee. I would love to get my finances under control. There are all these things piling up on our bank statements, and I think I need to fix this problem. I need to sort this out and to stop this.
I mean, my finances are so chaotic that I need this app.
So I'll tell you what it is. It's called Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending and it helps to lower your bills so that you can grow your savings.
With Rocket Money, you can track all of your subscriptions and you can easily cancel within the app with just a few taps, saving you time, avoiding charges. And you can also set budgets and goals and get personalized insights and regular reports to track how you're doing. They will even send you real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, refunds, and even low balances. So let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
That's rocketmoney.com/ishistory. rocketmoney.com/ishistory. This episode is brought to you by Uber. Now, do you know that feeling when someone shows up for you when you need it most?
We all need that sometimes. And Uber knows it.
Uber isn't just a ride or a meal delivered. It's showing up no matter what.
Like for your long distance friends, bringing soup when they're sick, sending flowers when they're down.
When it really matters, whatever it is, you show up. Where there's a will, we're on our way.
Uber, on our way. Download the app today. Hello and welcome back to The Rest is History. We are in Whitechapel, East London, and people on the streets of the East End and beyond are coming to terms with the fact that a second, or perhaps even third, gruesome murder has been committed by the man who is not yet called Jack the Ripper, but is already a massive star of the popular press. And the news breaks during the course of Saturday the 8th, and journalists, editors go berserk. And we were talking in the first half, Dominic, I mean, this essentially is their dream scenario. You've got another murder, and it seems to be even gorier than the previous one. So in our first episode, I quoted the Evening Star, which is the stuff about a ghoul stalking the streets of London and so on. This is when it runs. And the headline of that article was "Horror upon horror. Whitechapel is panic-stricken at another fiendish crime." And again, you can see that is absolutely calculated to fly off the newsstands. And it has to be said that the slightly posher, more quality broadsheets, as they would describe themselves, they're piling in as well. So the Daily Telegraph, still going strong today, at the time the best-selling newspaper in the world, it also buys into this kind of notion of the Gothic, of the supernatural. It tells its readers that the East End is haunted by, and I quote, beings who look like men but are rather demons, vampires. And the result is exactly what the press wants. Mass hysteria, mass excitement, a demand to know more, because there is a huge mystery. Who is doing this?
Yeah, it's absolutely. So there are huge crowds at the murder sites, or all the murder sites. There are crowds outside the mortuary, outside police stations. Reporters said that the crowds were particularly made up of women, and women would bring their children with them. And that's actually a phenomenon that you often see. I mean, we've seen it in recent British history, crowds of women outside, murder sites and police stations and so on.
Well, I think also, I gather that women are overwhelmingly the consumers of true crime podcasts.
They are indeed, yeah. And going back to the golden age of detective fiction, largely read by women, exactly so. Right to this day, true crime shows are watched or listened to by women. Interesting. I don't really have an answer for why that is, but it just is what it is. Some locals saw this as an opportunity to make money. So as ghoulish as it sounds, the neighbours on Hanbury Street opened up their houses and they would charge visitors a penny a head to come and look at the yard, to peer out at the yard of number 29. There was a man on Whitechapel Road who ran a sort of despondent little waxworks exhibition.
Yeah, the poor man's Madame Tussauds.
Yeah, and he got some red paint and daubed it on 3 waxworks, and he charged people a penny to come and see the George Yard, Bucks Row and Hanbury Street victims. And there are loads of stories of kind of copycats and false alarms and people almost being lynched. So that very first evening, a man punches a policeman in the pub or something and is basically taken to the police station and the word gets around, we've got the Whitechapel murderer. And so people pile in and they're desperate to lynch this bloke. Basically, he's just had a fight in a pub. That's all it is.
And there are some kind of properly suspicious people as well that the police are feeling their collars, right?
Yeah, there are. So in the next sort of week or two, the police arrested 9 different people and interrogated them on the suspicion that they might be the killer. And it's tempting to laugh at the police and say, oh, they got it wrong, which they did with all of these men. But it's instructive to look at who they arrested because it shows you how their minds are working. So to give a couple of examples, there's a German barber called Charles Ludwig who was arrested with a prostitute. And he was carrying a clasp knife, a razor, and a pair of scissors with him.
Yeah, that's suspicious.
You could say the tools of his trade, or you could say she was terrified when police finally found them, and she was worried that he was going to murder her. And, he fits, to some extent, he fits the bill, right? It makes sense. Then there's a butcher, a pork butcher from Switzerland called Jakob Eisenschmidt. He was a drinker. He suffered depression. He would often sort of meaningfully sharpen his long knife at people, which I think didn't inspire great confidence.
Again, suspicious behaviour.
Yeah. And also he'd been in and out of lunatic asylums. And he had a strange habit of, he would sometimes get hold of bullocks' entrails and post them to his old shop as a sort of threat.
I think the evidence is stacking up. And it's also interesting that both of those men are foreign.
Yes.
And Mrs. Long had said that the person that she'd seen talking to Annie Chapman, he looked to me like a foreigner.
Yeah.
And this sense of whether the Ripper is a foreigner or not becomes quite important to editorials and so on, because there's a kind of assumption that no Englishman could possibly be doing this, that it must be someone from abroad.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. And the most significant of these early suspects is also somebody with an overseas background. And he is a shoemaker, a Jewish shoemaker called John Pizer, who was arrested on the 10th. And he is the man who was mentioned in the last episode because his nickname was Leather Apron. And in the days and weeks since the Polly Nichols murder, his name or his nickname had appeared a lot in the press. And the press had said there's this bloke apparently called Leather Apron who goes around harassing prostitutes and threatening them and beating them up.
It's such a terrifying name, isn't it? And I do think that in these cases, a suspect with a terrifying name ramps up the tension massively.
Oh, definitely it does. So there was a hunt for this bloke, Leather Apron. They find him at last, and he does tick a lot of boxes. He's 5'4". He has a very strong Polish accent, and he has a history of violence with a shoemaker's knife. And the police genuinely, I think at first think, this is the guy.
This is him, yeah.
But unfortunately, he has a pretty cast iron alibi for Polly Nichols' murder, because he'd been staying at a lodging house and he'd gone outside with the owner of the lodging house to watch a fire at London docks. They'd watched it in the distance. And the bloke from the lodging house said, I absolutely know for sure I spent the evening with this bloke because we stood together watching the fire and talking about it. And with all of these people, with almost all of these people, they were still in custody when future murders happened, so the police could be certain that it wasn't them. But people start to mock the police, so that the humorous magazine Punch produced a kind of parody called A Detective's Diary. And they said, oh, we heard that there's a rumor that the bloke wore a blue coat, so we arrested everybody who wore blue coats. The blue coat people were innocent. We heard it might be a soldier. We found a small drummer boy. We arrested him and all this kind of thing, which is sort of mildly amusing, but it's not really fair because actually there is definitely method in their madness.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you're kind of going around thrusting daggers and knives in the face of prostitutes.
Right. Yeah.
I would arrest them.
Yeah, correct. Exactly. So actually, of these people they arrested, 3 of them had been in asylums. 3 of them were widely regarded as being of unsound mind. 5 of them knew about anatomy. One, there might be butchers or slaughtermen or whatever. Interestingly, only 3 of them actually had been born abroad. So the element about being a foreigner, she's vague about that. She can't really explain why she thinks he's a foreigner. So the police clearly don't put as much weight on that as they do on other elements of her testimony.
Because obviously the police know that English people are perfectly capable of doing murders because they, they're arresting murderers all the time.
Yes, I think that's fair, actually. Now, this business about being a foreigner, though, it is incendiary because it's so dangerous for one group in particular. And this takes us back to the social background of Whitechapel. Whitechapel has been transformed in the last 10 years, in particular, by Jewish immigration. So in 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in St. Petersburg. And that kicked off wave upon wave of repressive anti-Semitic legislation and then pogroms in the Russian Empire. And people are fleeing that and fleeing to Britain in particular, or the United States. So in 20 years, the Russian and Polish population of London went from less than 9,000 people to almost 54,000 people, concentrated above all in East End neighbourhoods like Spitalfields or Mile End or Whitechapel. And if you read Jerry White's brilliant book on 19th century London, he talks about how there's an undercurrent of anti-Semitism all through this period. In some ways, quite small-scale stuff. It's kind of broken windows, it's graffiti, it's newspaper cartoons, it's kind of, punch-ups on the street and stuff. But, I said in the previous episode, there's been an economic depression, really, since the early 1870s. So there's a lot of job competition, there's a lot of anxiety about people coming over here and stealing our jobs and whatnot. And so it's not surprising that straight away some of the newspapers and some people on the streets say, the killer must be a Jew.
And that's one of the reasons why Leather Apron is such a kind of popular candidate to have been the murderer, isn't it? Because he is Jewish.
Yes, exactly. And it's not surprising either that prominent Jews are then keen to push back. So the very first reward that was put up for the killer's capture was put up by Whitechapel's MP, who was a liberal, who was Samuel Montague, who was an Orthodox Jew and was a kind of proto-Zionist. And he put up £100 for the killer. And he was then backed up by a group called the Mile End Vigilance Committee, which will play a bit of a part in this whole series. And the Mile End Vigilance Committee was set up by local, largely Jewish traders and shopkeepers. And as we will see, they became nationally famous because they were to receive a letter and a hideous gift from somebody who may well have been the killer himself.
From hell.
From hell, exactly. Now, the police are not terribly keen on groups like this. First of all, the Home Office don't like rewards. Arguing about rewards, whether or not to give a reward, is a big, big part of the kind of police investigation. And the Home Office hate rewards because they say, basically, if somebody knew who the killer was, they'd tell us because his crimes are so horrible. And almost by definition, anyone who gives us information hoping for a reward is probably a hoaxer, and it's probably a false lead. And actually, the weird thing is that Abberline and his colleagues, on the one hand, they wish they could have more clues, but on the other, they actually have too much information.
Yeah.
They have so many false leads and so many rumors and allegations and stuff.
Well, I suppose, Dominic, that the fact that, you were saying how there's a mass market now for the press means that there are vastly more numbers who can read these stories and say, oh, it could be this or it could be that, or I've got this idea or I've got that clue. So the letters just keep coming in, right?
Of course. And right, their filing system collapses under the strain. They have no computers. It's actually the same story, oddly, as what happened in the 1970s in West Yorkshire with the Yorkshire Ripper. Again, a pre-computer world where they were totally overwhelmed by too much information. So the days go by, there is no breakthrough, and the pressure begins to build on the authorities. So by the 14th of September, the Star is calling the Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, and I quote, a feeble mountebank who would pose and simper over the brink of a volcano. It's really like reading one of my old columns, actually.
Well, I mean, it's amazing to know that Home Secretaries were getting abuse back then, as they do now.
Yeah. And even the Telegraph, a Tory paper, which should be supporting him, said of Mr. Matthews, we've had enough of Mr. Matthews, who knows nothing, has heard nothing, and does not intend to do anything. I mean, plus ça change. Even so, you get to late September, and there is a sense, I think, that maybe the panic is easing. The authorities have weathered the storm. Things are, the killer has not yet struck again. It's a fine summer. The weather has been dry. People are out and about. Some of the fear has dissipated. And then on the 22nd of September, another murder grips the public imagination. Another woman has been killed. Her name is Jane Beadmore. But she has been stabbed and killed on a fell outside Gateshead in the northeast of England.
So a long way from the East End.
A long way, hundreds of miles away. Now, at first, there is speculation she's another victim of the Whitechapel murderer. As it turns out, she was actually murdered by her ex-boyfriend. She dumped him. It was a crime of passion, and he killed her.
So like Mariah Martin and the Red Barn.
Right. But at the time, people said, well, maybe this killer has moved north. So again, there's a sort of slackening of tension in the East End. And on the 27th of September, the Daily News sent a reporter to Whitechapel, and he wrote a long feature about the atmosphere. And he said, a few days ago, he said, people seemed very, very shocked and very frightened. But now he says things are back to normal. And he paints, you can look it up online. It's on the kind of casebook, Jack the Ripper casebook website, this story. And he paints a really vivid picture of Whitechapel, the steaming cookshops, the flaring gin palaces and noisy shows, the cheap jacks and shooting galleries, the streaming lights and roar and rattle and hurrying throngs and noisy groups.
Dominic, we mentioned that it's the entertainment capital of the entire East End. So lots to do.
And a lot of eccentric entertainment, shall we say. So he finds people crowding around a performing boy with no legs, for example, or a huge crowd around a trader who's selling trousers for 9 shillings. And he stops in Hanbury Street, which is where Annie Chapman had been found. He stops an elderly passerby and he says to this bloke, people don't seem very anxious about these murders. And the guy says to him, no, there's very little anxiety. People, most of them, they think he's gone to Gateshead. But has he gone to Gateshead? Because that same day, the 27th, the editor of the Central News Office in London gets a letter written in red ink. And that is the letter, Tom, with which we began the first episode. Do you want to read us a couple of extracts to remind people?
Yeah, so just to remind people of what he said. I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I'm down on oars, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. I love my work and want to start again. You'll soon hear of me with my funny little games. And he said that he'd saved blood from the last job, so Annie Chapman to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. And then he says, the next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. So we said this is the most notorious letter in the entire history of crime. And the reason for its fame is the sign-off, because it ends, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name.
Yes.
And the reaction of the editor at the news agency, to begin with, is a hoax. Because obviously there have been lots of other letters that have been obvious hoaxes. And so there is this question hanging, well, was it a hoax or is it real?
We'll come back to this in the next episode, but most experts think it's a hoax. The killer never did cut off a victim's ears. So he did mutilate a future victim, Catherine Eddowes, and cut off the lobe of one of her ears, but that was a minor thing compared with the other mutilations he carried out. Philip Sugden points out that this letter, people can Google it, they can see lots of examples of it online. The punctuation is all over the place, but there is not a single spelling mistake. So Sugden says it seems like the work of an educated man pretending to be an uneducated one. He thinks it's revealing that it's sent to a news agency, not the police. In other words, it's a letter sent not to taunt the police, but to get the maximum possible publicity. And Sugden also notes the postcode, the East Central postcode, which covered Fleet Street, the offices of the major newspapers. And he thinks this is probably the work of a young reporter who is having a bit of fun and is hoping to generate a story. And that would tally with the Jack the Ripper nickname, because, first of all, the ripping bit of it, the Ripper. The newspapers had used the word ripping and ripper a lot. They described the ripping open of the bodies. So for somebody who's immersed in the world of newspapers, that would make sense. And then the second thing, Jack. Jack is the most common name for criminals in the penny dreadfuls that I mentioned in the first half.
And of course, monkeys.
And monkeys, well, that occurred to me as well. So when we did our episode about history's greatest monkeys, a lot of them were called Jack. Jack Macaco, Jack the Signalman, Corporal Jackie, and so on. Jack was a standard name that you reached for, if you were creating a character, should we say.
Yeah, and there's a hint of a kind of a rogue, a lad, an adventurer as well, isn't there?
Jack the Lad, exactly. So one of the most popular figures on the Victorian stage was the 18th century burglar Jack Sheppard. And there was also a kind of urban legend. I mean, it seems mad now that there would be such an urban legend, but it was very popular in the sort of middle of the 19th century. An urban legend of somebody called Spring-Heeled Jack, who would kind of leap out and attack young girls and young women.
Yeah, and kind of vanish in a blaze of fire.
Yeah, and these sort of rumours of this character, it's the kind of thing kids would tell each other in the playground. There's this bloke called Spring-Heeled Jack who kind of leaps out and then vanishes again. The nickname is precisely the kind of nickname I think that a young journalist who goes to the stage a lot, goes to the theatre, reads penny dreadfuls, would choose. And it's an exciting, newsworthy name.
Yeah, and the evidence for that is that it goes viral, doesn't it?
It does go viral, exactly, based purely on this, right? So the editor of the Central News Agency doesn't think it's real. But 2 days later, he passes it to Scotland Yard anyway and says, you might want to just check this out. And then that very evening comes the most dramatic episode of the whole story, one of the most gruesome nights in London's history. So we'll start in Berners Street, in the heart of Whitechapel. It's the evening of Saturday, the 29th of September. And we are at specifically a sort of courtyard called Dutfield's Yard, and it was enclosed by a row of cottages, by a print workshop, and by the International Working Men's Educational Club, which was a socialist club for Russian and Polish Jews. And every Saturday night, this club had debates about socialism and whatnot. And it breaks up, the debate breaks up at about 11:30. Most people go, but a few of them stay upstairs in the reading room to chat. Now, in the other buildings around the yard, people are still working. So the print workshop, people are coming and going. The lights are kind of burning. At about 12:40, the chairman of the Socialist Club, who's a guy called Maurice Eagle, he comes into the yard. He's been walking a lady friend home, and he can hear someone singing in Russian upstairs at the club. Perfectly normal. He goes through the gates. He goes through the yard. He doesn't notice anything strange in the yard at all. So I'm telling you this because it gives people a sense of the window of time. Then 20 minutes later, a man riding a little cart comes into the yard, and he's a Russian Jew called Louis Diemschutz. He's the steward of the club, and he lives there with his wife, and he's been out selling jewelry all day. And he turns his cart into the yard, and almost immediately the pony shies away, and he looks down to the right, and he sees something huddled by the wall of the club in the darkness. And he prods this thing with his whip, and it doesn't move, and he lights a match, and it's a human body. And he runs upstairs to the club to get help from his wife and so on. And then he runs back. And as his wife later told the press, I at once recognized it as the body of a woman, while to add to my horror, I saw a stream of blood. She was lying on her back with her head against the wall, and the face looked ghastly. And a crowd gathers, and they lift her head, they light a match, and they see a gash in her throat. They go and get the police. The police arrive. They bring a doctor. The doctor is there by about 1:15, and he says she's been dead for about 20 minutes or half an hour. So in other words, once again, this has happened very, very quickly. And then about half an hour later, Detective Inspector Reed of the Metropolitan Police arrives, and eventually they identify this woman. Her name is Elizabeth Stride. We'll tell her story in the bonus episode for our club members. Just very briefly, she's an immigrant herself. She's from Gothenburg in Sweden. She'd been a domestic servant. Then, almost certainly in Gothenburg, she was a prostitute. She came to England. She married a bloke called Stride. They set up a coffee house which collapsed. Her marriage fell apart. It's a very familiar story. The spiral of poverty, homelessness, and so on. She had cleaning jobs, but she also definitely worked as a prostitute. And she'd probably gone out soliciting that night, hoping to get some money for lodgings. Again, a very familiar story. And there are intriguing witness reports that describe her talking to a man. And we'll talk about them next time. But for now, let's rewind to the discovery of the body in Dutfield's yard. So that was just before 1 o'clock in the morning, right? But the drama is not yet over. So if we move the camera now 3/4 of a mile to the west, 12 minutes walk away, and we're now in another enclosed space, Mitre Square, just off Aldgate, which is close to the eastern edge of the City of London. And this has a very different feel. It's not that far away. It's only 12 minutes walk, but the atmosphere is different. This is much more respectable. It's a square lined with offices and warehouses, and it's pretty empty.
And it's in the City of London, so there is a different police jurisdiction there. It's a much older centre of habitation, and the name Mitre derives from the fact that a priory had stood on the site.
Oh, nice. So it's this dull, lonely spot surrounded by offices and warehouses. And at 1:30, so we're talking about just over half an hour after Elizabeth Stride's body was found, at 1:30, Police Constable Edward Watkins entered Mitre Square as part of his regular nighttime beat. And he walks into the square, and there's no sound but his own footsteps. And he looks around the square, and there's nothing. Seems completely deserted. So he leaves the square at the far end, and he carries on his beat, and it takes him 15 minutes to come round. So now he's come round, and he comes back into the square, and it's 1:44. And again, he hears nothing. And then, by his own account, I turned sharp round to the right, and flashing my light, I saw it in front of me. A more dreadful sight I never saw. It quite knocked me over. And he runs towards the nearest lit window, which is a warehouse on the far side. And there, the night watchman is sweeping up. And PC Watkins runs in and he shouts, "For God's sake, mate, come to my assistance. There's another woman cut to pieces." Because for the second time in barely an hour, Jack the Ripper has struck again.
But who, Dominic, has he slain? And what further horrors may lie ahead? And Rest is History Club members can find out right away, because the next 3 episodes, including the final episode in which we will be unmasking the identity of the murderer, are available to hear right now. And if you would like to hear them too, and you're not signed up to the Rest is History Club, then you can go to therestishistory.com and do so there. Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Throughout time, celebration has meant giving. So the Romans at Saturnalia handed out all kinds of gifts. The 3 magi handed out gold, frankincense and myrrh. And the Victorians absolutely loved wrapping things up in paper and then tying it up in string.
Tom, those are lovely gestures, but I wonder if they're a little bit too extravagant for the typical Christmas morning. So this year, here's my suggestion to our listeners and our viewers. Why not give something a little bit more enlightened? Why not give the gift of the Rest is History Club membership? It's the discerning choice for anybody who prefers a Hannibal to a hamper.
It's ad-free listening. You get a weekly bonus episode. You get early access to live shows, and you get exclusive deep dive series.
Also, on top of that, this year's special gift edition of Rest is History Club membership comes with a sensational exclusive t-shirt. It will make you the envy of all your neighbours, and all the cool people in your neighbourhood, if such people exist, will admire you and want to spend more time with you. So just head to therestishistory.com and click on gifts. That is therestishistory.com, and please click on gifts.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify, spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.